Dana White recently came out and hinted that we might be getting a numbered pay-per-view somewhere in the UK, with guys like Leon Edwards and Tom Aspinall at the top of the card. And just looking at the upcoming UFC schedule, it makes sense that this would be at UFC 304 in July. We already thought we were going to get a Manchester Fight Night card in July. It seems like the UFC may have kind of changed up their plans and will not be going with a pay-per-view. So in this video, I kind of want to make a dream/realistic UFC 304 fight card if it does take place somewhere in the UK or in Manchester. Trying to keep it realistic, but this is the card that I would try to put together if I was a matchmaker at the UFC. We're going 16 fights deep in this card. Don't think it's going to be 16 fights, but really just wanted to make a ton of matchups here. Gonna have timestamps down below if you just want to jump to the main card, prelims, early prelims, whatever it may be. And then the only other thing is that I tried not to pick anyone who was already booked, and then at least one fighter in every matchup has some sort of connection to the UK or the surrounding countries. So let's just dive right into it. We're going to start off with 6 early prelims. Not going to spend too much time on this section, but we have Corey McKenna taking on Sam Hughes. Corey McKenna just recently suffered a quick submission loss, but she had been out for a while before she returned. She didn't take much damage in that fight, so I'd expect her to want to get back in there, and I think this Manchester card would be a great opportunity. I have her taking on Sam Hughes, who also lost earlier this year. I believe she was on the Mexico card, lost to Yasmin Hauergi. I just think compared to where these two are at, I think it makes sense. I think it's a fair matchup, and that's going to kick off this card. Then we have Sam Patterson taking on Rolando De Boya. Sam Patterson picked up a UFC win after he went up to 170 in his most recent fight. Rolando De Boya is 0-2 in the UFC, but he's been competitive. He had a pretty solid debut split decision against Chaos Williams, so I think that's a fun matchup for the early prelims. Then we're going to go to heavyweight with Mick Parkin taking on Martin Budai. So Mick Parkin just picked up a win over Muhammad Usman at the Apex. He's 3-0 in the UFC, and spoiler alert, we're going to be getting a Tom Aspinall fight later on in this card. They're training partners. I think this would be a good opportunity for them to be in camp together. Makes sense for him to be on this card. Going up against Martin Budai, I think just a decent matchup. He's coming off a loss to Shamil Gaziev, but he had picked up a few UFC wins before that. So a solid heavyweight matchup. The next fight is going to be Chris Duncan taking on Mason Jones. Chris Duncan has already logged a few fights in the UFC from Scotland, and actually this is going to be the one matchup I think where both guys have some sort of connection to the region, because I'm going to have Mason Jones coming back to the UFC. He had a 4-fight run in the UFC previously. He went 1-2-1, but his 2 losses were against pretty high levels of competition, so not going to ding him too much. I don't think he was released from the UFC. I think they wanted to re-sign him, but they just couldn't come to terms, so he went back to Cage Warriors. He's logged 3 straight wins since him and the UFC parted ways. I think this is the perfect opportunity for him to get back into the UFC. I think he proved in his time with the UFC that he is, of the caliber to be in the promotion, and then he just went on, logged some nice wins outside of it. So I think this is the perfect return opportunity. Both guys have some sort of connection with this Manchester card. Then we're going to go with Christian Leroy Duncan taking on Marc-Andre Barriault. Christian Leroy Duncan coming off a very impressive win to start off 2024. Marc-Andre Barriault coming off a pretty close loss to Chris Curtis. So I think just based on these guys' previous performances, Duncan should be getting a little bit of a bump up in competition. Marc-Andre Barriault probably coming down a little bit. This is probably going to take place on the feet, and I think it'll just be a fun striking match between these two. And then the final fight on the early prelims, Casey O'Neill taking on Luana Carolina. Casey O'Neill, since she messed up her knee, has been 0-2. She's coming off a tough loss. I think this is a spot where she needs to take a step back in competition. I think Luana Carolina is that. Luana Carolina has also already proven that she will make this trip to the UK to fight on these cards. She had a loss to Molly McCann. I think she might have also fought Joanne Wood on one of these cards, so she's willing to make the trip. I think this makes sense with Luana Carolina coming off a W. She's getting a step up in competition, and then Casey O'Neill taking a little bit of a step down, an opportunity for her to kind of get right here. Now shifting over to the prelims, we have 4 prelim fights. Going to start it off with Jai Herbert taking on John McDessie. Jai Herbert just seems to be like a staple on these England-London cards. And then I like the matchup of him going up against John McDessie. These are 2 strikers. They're going to go out there, have a fun striking match. I think it makes sense from a matchmaking perspective. Then we're going to go with 2 kind of veteran bantamweights. Davy Grant taking on Ione Barcelos. Another matchup that I think is probably going to take place on the feet. Davy Grant is always in fun scraps. Tony Barcelos is going to stand in there and throw also. He's coming off a nice win earlier on this year at UFC Mexico, so I think that fight makes a lot of sense. We had to have Molly McCann on this card up next, and I do think it's possible they give her a little bit of a softer matchup than what I'm going to suggest, just to kind of, let her continue to settle in at 115, maybe help her get a nice highlight in front of the home crowd. She's had the 2 nice knockouts there against Hannah Goldie and Luana Carolina, but I think if they want to kind of, get her ready to jump into the rankings, I think a matchup between Loma Lukabunmi would be pretty entertaining. Both these women are pretty small stature-wise, just in terms of like height and reach at this division, so it kind of makes sense even though it is the lowest division. Both going to be a little bit undersized, at least like I said, in terms of height and reach. I think this will also take place on the feet, which is, even though Molly McCann's coming off a submission win, she typically, when she loses, it's because she gets taken down, controlled, submitted. She's probably going to want to stay on the feet. Loma's going to give her that opportunity, so I think this could be an interesting matchup, but like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if they gave her someone a little bit softer. And then the featured prelim is going to be Nathaniel Wood taking on Julian Erosa. Nathaniel Wood has been on a few of these London cards. Julian Erosa coming off a big win at the UFC Apex on that Rose Namajunas Amanda Hebos card. I just think this is a really fun fight between 2 featherweights that are always in really nice scraps. Now, shifting over to the main event, I think the early prelims, they're fine. I think the main card is really where the strength of this potential pay-per-view is going to lie. I have a 6-fight main card. I think it would be 5 on the actual pay-per-view, but 6 quality fights that I think we could make that is deserving of being on this main card. We're going to start it off with Paddy Pimblett taking on Drew Dober. At this point with Paddy Pimblett, we need to see him take that jump up in competition. He's 5-0 in the UFC. He had a very close fight to Jared Gordon. Then he got the Tony Ferguson fight. Won that pretty handedly, but still didn't really stamp it. I think it's time for him to jump up, get a shot at the rankings, and I think Drew Dober is the perfect opponent here. He's ranked at number 15, so if Paddy does end up beating him, he would get into the rankings, sets up a ton of new opportunities for the UFC and for Paddy. Drew Dober's also coming off a loss, so it's not like he has this invincible aura that he's going to be like impossible to beat and that he'll just run through Paddy Pimblett. Plus, I think Drew Dober has actually, called for this fight at least a few different times. And then, obviously, if you're the UFC, right, and you have this guy who's super popular in Paddy Pimblett, or maybe not popular, he is popular, but, kind of polarizing, you want the opponent, if someone does beat them, to be able to kind of capitalize on that star power, right? You don't want to give them a super tough matchup with a guy with not a ton of personality, no name, because you're not really getting a payoff if Paddy loses. If Drew Dober were to beat Paddy Pimblett, which I think he'd probably be the favorite, he's someone you could put into a lot of really fun fights at 155. He's marketable, so I don't think that's a concern. I really like this Paddy Pimblett-Drew Dober fight. I also think you could be looking at a Matt Frevola potential opponent. I think him and Drew Dober are kind of in the same range in terms of, opponent quality, but Drew Dober would get him into the rankings. Now, the next matchup on the main card, this fight was kind of already leaked or, just some reports that it was in talks. Arnold Allen taking on Giga Chikadze. It was also rumored to be taking place sometime in July, which you'd assume would be on this card. But you never know with the UFC sometimes. I think it makes sense, Arnold Allen coming off the close loss to Movsar Evloev. Giga Chikadze is coming off a win. Arnold Allen probably should be fighting back. Giga should be fighting up. It's also just a fun matchup. Arnold Allen's a dude who went out there and stood with Max Holloway for 5 rounds. I think he'll do the same with Giga, and it should just be a fun fight on the feet. Next is going to be Michael Venom Page, and I kind of went back and forth on potential opponents. I ended up settling on Gilbert Burns. I know a lot of people are going to want the Wonderboy fight, and I get it. They're 2 of the best strikers in the division, if not the clear top 2. The problem with that fight is that neither really seemed to want it. Wonderboy, I think right when the UFC signed MVP, someone asked him like if he'd be interested in that fight, and he didn't seem super interested. It basically seemed like he was pretty friendly with MVP, and he didn't really want to fight someone that he was kind of friendly with. And then MVP has come out after his win against Kevin Holland, and he's basically talked about how he doesn't think it's going to be a super exciting fight. They're both so technical, they'll be feinting, making reads, and, it'll be high level. They'll know what's going on, but it might not be super entertaining for the fans. And if both guys are telling me that they don't really want the fight, I'm not super hyped in seeing it. Obviously, if they book it, I'm not going to be upset. I think it would be very interesting, but if neither guy wants it, I'm not going to force it here. The problem with that, though, is that outside of Wonder Boy, there's not a ton of top options at 170. We're going to have a 170-pound title fight on this card. The third to last fight is also going to be at 170, so the options are kind of limited here. You also have Shavkat and Jack Della Maddalena. It seems like they're circling each other. So are you going with a Jeff Neal, a Sean Brady, a Vicente Luque? For me, I'm going to be going with Gilbert Burns here. MVP's 36. I don't know if he wants to make this slow climb to the title, right? A fight against Gilbert Burns, he wins that one. He's probably max one more win away from getting a title shot. And then for Gilbert Burns, if he beats MVP, who has a big name on a pay-per-view on this big stage, that could throw him right back into the title picture, which is where I think he wants to be at age 37. I think the only thing that could limit this is if Gilbert Burns is going to return this quickly, right? Coming off a pretty rough loss to Jack Della Maddalena, got finished. However, in some of his previous losses by finish, I think it was the Kamaru Usman knockout and the Dan Hooker knockout, he's returned in around 5 months, which is a somewhat similar time to when this fight would be taking place in July. So it is possible, if it's not Gilbert Burns, maybe Vicente Luque if he wins this weekend. The Sean Brady matchup just isn't super interesting for me stylistically. I don't think people want to see MVP get taken down and controlled. I think Jeff Neal could be interesting, but I don't think it would be the top option just because he's coming off a loss. Doesn't quite have the same steam as some of the other guys. Now shifting over to the next fight, this was the other 170 fight I kind of hinted at. Ian Gary taking on Colby Covington. In my opinion, this is the perfect fight to make for both of these guys, and I think having it somewhere in the UK is the perfect location. These are probably two of the most disliked welterweights, both for different reasons. Ian Gary, you've got everyone going after his personal situation, his personal life, all of that stuff. For Colby Covington, he talked a lot of stuff heading into that Leon fight, said some stuff about his dead father, and not only did he say that stuff, which a lot of people thought was messed up to begin with, he did not perform. He did not fight like someone who was talking trash about someone's dead dad. He went out there, he just let Leon pick him apart. He looked completely shocked, and it wasn't a great look out of Colby Covington. And then he also had a ton of excuses after the fight. So by matching up two of the more disliked guys in the division, you're going to have people who, either really hate Ian Gary or really hate Colby Covington. They're going to jump on board the other one's bandwagon. And I think the location is perfect because from the UFC's perspective, right, Ian Gary is the long-term guy here, right? He could be competing for the title for years to come. Colby Covington, he's had 3 title fights, getting up there in age a little bit MMA-wise. He's probably going to be a guy you get a few big fights out of, and then, he might be done at like the top of main cards. So if Ian Gary goes out there, he's going to seem, a lot more popular in the UK. If he goes out there, gets a win over Colby Covington, he will feel like a star in terms of how he's being treated by the fans. And then for Colby Covington, him going to enemy territory is the perfect opportunity for him to kind of play his heel character. We saw him do it in Brazil. I think he could, emulate a similar thing here going up against Ian Gary somewhere in the UK. So I really like this fight. I think it makes sense rankings-wise. The location's perfect. And I think stylistically it's also pretty interesting. So now shifting over to the main and the co-main. In the co-main event, we're going to have the rematch, Tom Aspinall taking on Curtis Blades. If it's not Tom Aspinall fighting John Jones or Stipe, this is the next best option, and I do want to put it on record. I think Tom Aspinall should be fighting John Jones. He's the interim champion. Those are the 2 best heavyweights in the UFC at this point. Tom Aspinall should be getting to challenge John Jones, but it doesn't seem like that's going to happen, so we're being realistic with this one. I think he's going up against Curtis Blades here. Cyril Gane would be the other potential matchup, and I think it would be a fun fight, but Gane has 2 title shots in his last 4 fights, and then his 2 wins, in between those, were Tai Tuivasa and Sergey Spivak. I think Curtis Blades' recent win over Jailton Almeida pretty much trumps any win that Cyril Gane has in his career, and then I also think this is just one that we needed to see run back. They were facing off in a main event in one of the London fight nights. Aspinall has a knee injury 15 seconds into the fight. We need to see this one again. Stylistically, it's interesting. I think Curtis Blades has put in his time. He's earned the opportunity. And if Tom Aspinall is going to defend that interim belt, this is really like the perfect, venue location for him to actually want to do that. And then the final fight, the main event, it has to happen. Leon Edwards, Bilal Muhammad 2. Bilal's on a 10-fight unbeaten streak. The only one of those that wasn't a win was the eye poke no contest to Leon Edwards. Kind of interesting that the main and co-main both had like weird endings. The eye poke no contest, and then Tom Aspinall blowing out his knee. But I think this fight, like, fans don't seem overly excited. They'd probably get more hyped if it was Shavkat taking on Leon Edwards. But I think this fight taking place somewhere in the UK, if it is in Manchester, I think it'll make it seem bigger because Leon Edwards will kind of be like the clear guy on top. Instead of putting it on like UFC 300 where people aren't super hyped, Leon will be getting a lot of love back in the UK. We saw when he main evented against Kamaru Usman in the trilogy. Leon's going to feel like a star. It's going to make this title fight feel bigger, and I think that is why it should main event this card. And then at some point, right, we just got to respect Belal Muhammad. I know the UFC likes to go with the big name, the most popular fighters, but there has to be some sort of way you can earn a title shot, and Belal Muhammad has done more than enough to get that. So that's going to wrap it up for my potential UFC 304 Manchester pay-per-view card. Just to run through the main events again: Leon Edwards, Belal Muhammad 2, Tom Aspinall, Curtis Blades 2, Ian Gary, Colby Covington, Michael Venom Page, Gilbert Burns, Arnold Allen, Giga Chikadze, and Paddy Pimblett taking on Drew Dober. If I missed anyone that you think should be on this card, let me know down below. How are we feeling about these matchups? Want to hear your feedback down below in the comment section. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.